Hello everyone, and welcome to my BNB CBS Gossip 24 channel. Steffy orchestrated the hostage situation to force Sheila into captivity, and the Verity, when unraveled beachfront by beachfront, revealed a masterclass in manipulation so nipping and scrupulous that it readdressed every relationship, every feud, and every so-called act of heroism leading up to that explosive moment. Because what the world believed was a robotic act of madness by Sheila Carter was in fact the final move in a long, advised chess game finagled by Steffy Forrester, who had reached a breaking point where fear, rage, and the instinct to cover her family fused into commodity far more dangerous than anyone anticipated. For months Steffy had watched Sheila slide in and out of their lives, weaponizing gashes, justifications, and strained vulnerability, always managing to shirk lasting consequences, always returning like a ghost no captivity wall or restraining order could keep buried, and each time Sheila resurfaced, Steffy felt the mesh tensing around her family's future, her children's safety, and her own reason, until the moment she realized that the system would no way truly stop Sheila unless Sheila destroyed herself in the public eye, unmistakably and irrevocably. From that consummation grew a plan so bold it framed on unbelievable, one that needed Steffy to step into moral darkness she had always condemned, because she knew that only an act so extreme, so inarguable, would eventually strip Sheila of her capability to charm judges, manipulate victims, and twist the narrative in her favor. Steffy began by studying Sheila the way one studies a bloodsucker, learning her patterns, her triggers, her preoccupation with family, and overall her hopeless need to be seen as Ms. New rather than monstrous. And it was that cerebral weak point Steffy decided to exploit, subtly nudging Sheila into situations that inflamed her paranoia and corroborated her belief that everyone was conspiring against her, all while maintaining the facade of reticent forbearance and guarded civility. Every hassle was offered to escalate pressure just enough, every warning delivered with calculated timing, every boundary drawn in a way that Sheila would feel challenged rather than subdued. Because Steffy understood that Sheila didn't reply to sense or law but to perceived rejection and trouble, and so Steffy fed that perception precisely, planting the seeds of an extremity that could only end in catastrophe. When the day of the hostage situation eventually arrived, nothing about it was accidental, from the position chosen for its emblematic ties to family and heritage, to the presence of substantiations whose responses would amplify the drama beyond any possibility of denial, and indeed the timing, which assured that law enforcement, media, and the Forrester family would collide in one unpredictable, indelible moment. Sheila, formerly emotionally cornered and convinced she was about to lose everything yet again, walked straight into the trap Steffy had designed, believing she was seizing control when in fact she was surrendering it, because the fear, the armament, the pitfalls, and the hostage itself were all foreseeable issues Steffy had anticipated with intimidating perfection. As the situation unfolded, Steffy played her part faultlessly, appearing shaken yet bent, alarmed yet recalcitrant, allowing Sheila to believe she still held power while subtly steering her toward choices that would be insolvable to explain down laterally, choices that would be captured, recorded, and seared into the public knowledge. The hostage extremity escalated exactly as Steffy knew it would, with Sheila's mask eventually cracking under pressure, revealing the volatility and imminence that Steffy had spent months trying to prove was beneath the face, and when authorities interposed, there was no nebulosity left to exploit, no sympathetic angle to vend, no story Sheila could spin that would abolish the image of her holding someone's life in her hands. The fate was seismic, because as the Verity began to blunder out, first through hushed allegations, also through inarguable substantiation of Steffy's previous knowledge and subtle manipulations, the narrative shifted from a simple crime story to a moral reckoning that shook the Forrester family to its core, forcing them to defy the uncomfortable reality that Steffy, the fierce protection they respected, had crossed a line that could no way be completely uncrossed. Yet indeed, as whispers of orchestrated and set up spread, the legal outgrowth remained unchanged, because Sheila was eventually, definitively shamefaced in the eyes of the law, her conduct too extreme, too public, too dangerous to be softened by claims of provocation, and the captivity doors closed behind her with a futurity that had escaped justice for times. What haunted Steffy most wasn't the discipline Sheila entered but the reflection gaping back at her subsequently, because she had won, yes, but at the cost of her own innocence, carrying the knowledge that she had finagled a moment of terror to secure safety. that she had used fear as armament just as Sheila always had. The disclosure tore through connections, leaving abettors disaccorded and adversaries vindicated. As some praised Steffy for doing what no bone differently had the courage to do, while others quailed at the idea that she had come judge, jury, and unseen mastermind of a crime, blurring the line between justice and revenge. Still, in the quiet moments, when Steffy watched her children sleep without fear of Sheila's shadow brewing over them, she couldn't bring herself to lament the outgrowth, indeed if she questioned the system, because the hostage situation, as terrible as it was, had eventually exposed Sheila beyond redemption, indurating her true nature in a single, inarguable act that no courtroom theatrics could undo. In the end, the reproach wasn't just that Sheila went to captivity, but that the world learned how far Steffy Forrester was willing to go to cover what she loved, revealing a verity more unsettling than any villain harangue, that occasionally the most dangerous plans aren't born of madness, but of cold, deliberate love stoned into resoluteness. And that the hostage extremity exposed not only Sheila's downfall but Steffy's metamorphosis into someone able of orchestrating chaos in the name of peace, leaving behind a heritage ever marked by the question no bone could answer with certainty: did Steffy destroy Sheila, or did Sheila simply walk straight into the masterpiece of her own death? In the weeks that followed Sheila's imprisonment, the fallout from the exposed hostage situation continued to ripple outward like a shockwave that refused to dissipate, because the verity didn't land all at formerly but arrived in fractions, each disclosure shelling back another subcast of Steffy's master plan and forcing everyone involved to reassess not only what had happened but who Steffy had come in the process. And as investigators still redefined timelines, textbook dispatches, chance hassles, and ostensibly accessible concurrence, a picture surfaced that was insolvable to ignore. Steffy hadn't simply anticipated Sheila's breakdown, she had curated the conditions under which it would be ineluctable, engineering emotional pressure points with surgical perfection, icing that Sheila's sense of persecution would reach a boiling point at exactly the moment when substantiations, cameras, and law enforcement were poised to meet, musketeers who formerly dismissed Steffy's warnings. As paranoia began replaying exchanges in their minds, recalling how she had claimed certain doors remain uncorked, how she had encouraged specific meetings to do despite oral misgivings, how she had constantly emphasized that Sheila was able of anything in a tone that now sounded less like fear and more like forerunning, and it came sorrowfully clear that Steffy had been chronicling the ending long before the first gun was drawn. The moral nebulosity of her conduct resolved the Forrester family down the middle, with some arguing that Steffy had eventually outplayed a bloodsucker who thrived on loopholes and charity, while others quailed at the recrimination that she had weaponized another person's insecurity to manufacture a crime, no matter how justified the outgrowth might feel. And this division poisoned feasts, board meetings, and quiet moments likewise, because every regard carried an implied question about how important of what they were seeing now had always been there beneath Steffy's fierce surface, ridge, torn between pride and apprehension, plotted with the consummation that his son had inherited not only his strength but also a ruthless pragmatism he'd spent his life both using and lamenting, while Taylor scuffled with the haunting possibility that Steffy's trauma had calcified into commodity dangerous, a managing medium that replaced fear with control and empathy with computation. Meanwhile, the public narrative took on a life of its own, transubstantiating the hostage situation into an artistic spectacle where Steffy was alternatively hailed as a protection who did what the justice system could not, or condemned as a manipulator who played God with mortal lives, and every caption, every pundit debate, stoned the scrutiny, making it insolvable for Steffy to retreat into obscurity or silence indeed if she wanted to. Yet what utmost people failed to grasp was that the plan had no way been about spectacle for Steffy, but about futurity, about closing a chapter that had restarted too numerous times, because she knew that Sheila thrived in nebulosity, in Argentine areas where mistrustfulness could be spun into innocence and fear reframed as misreading, and the hostage extremity had annihilated that nebulosity in a way no restraining order or plea bargain ever could. Inside captivity walls, Sheila tasted this verity with a clarity that framed on preoccupation, replaying the events over and over, anatomizing every moment where she was acting of her own volition, only to realize, with mounting horror, how neatly she had been guided, how every perceived treason and trouble had been deposited just near enough to enkindle her worst impulses, and the consummation that she had been overreached not by the law but by Steffy herself fueled a stewing rage that no quantum of insulation could extinguish. Sheila told anyone who would hear that she had been set up, that Steffy had pushed her, that the system had eventually sided with the Forresters' power and influence, but her words chimed concave against the recorded substantiation of her conduct, the images burned into public memory, and the woeful irony that indeed if Steffy had orchestrated the conditions, Sheila had still chosen to pick up the armament, to take a life hostage, to cross the line that sealed her fate. This distinction came the fulcrum of every ethical debate girding the case, because it forced spectators to defy an uncomfortable verity about responsibility and manipulation, about how far one could push another person before responsibility blurred, and whether anticipating someone's worst instincts and creating space for them to act was itself a form of violence. Steffy, for her part, retreated inward, carrying herself with a composed surface that masked the grim tone interrogation beneath, because despite public posturing and private apologies, she couldn't escape the knowledge that she had rehearsed that day in her mind numerous times, that she had envisaged Sheila's unraveling as a necessary immolation, and that in doing so she had crossed a threshold from reactive victim to visionary mastermind of detriment. Insomniac nights came her constant companion, visited not by Sheila's imprisonment but by flashes of the hostage's terror, by the split second where the plan could have gone wrong, where someone could have failed, where Steffy herself might have been responsible for an outgrowth far darker than captivity bars, and it was in those moments that the weight of her decision pressed hardest, stripping away any vision of moral chastity. Connections continued to strain as loved bones plotted to attune the Steffy they knew with the strategist who had orchestrated chaos, and trust came a fragile currency, prorate out cautiously, because if Steffy could manipulate Sheila so completely, what differently might she be able of when pushed, and where would she draw the line next? Yet paradoxically, as time passed and the immediate peril faded, a strange calm settled over Steffy's life, a quiet that had been absent for times, because for the first time she wasn't looking over her shoulder, not bracing for Sheila's return, not preparing contingency plans for an adversary who refused to stay gone, and this peace, still tainted by guilt, corroborated her belief that the outgrowth had been worth the cost. The legal system, apathetic in philosophical nuance, moved forward decisively, closing prayers and denying movements that might have restarted Sheila's case, because anyhow of alleged provocation, the substantiation of the hostage crime stood untouchable, and the futurity Steffy had sought was codified into sentencing documents and sword doors that would not open fluently. Still, the story refused to end fairly, because the question of unity dallied like a moral earthquake, impacting how unborn conflicts were perceived, how Steffy's opinions were scanned, and how the Forrester heritage itself was reframed as one erected not only on creativity and adaptability but on a amenability to bend ethics in the name of survival. In quiet exchanges, some admitted that had they been in Steffy's position, scarified for times by a woman who slipped through every safeguard, they might have done the same, while others claimed that homogenizing similar tactics risked creating a world where manipulation played as justice, and trauma came in reason for preemptive atrocity. Sheila, insulated yet unbroken, clung to the belief that one day the verity of Steffy's involvement would outdo the crime itself, that history would flash back her not only as a villain but as a pawn in someone differently's ruthless strategy, and this belief sustained her through endless days behind bars, stropping her resentment into commodity patient and cold. Whether that resentment would ever find release remained an open question, but for now the balance of power had irrevocably shifted, with Steffy standing on the outside, free yet ever changed, and Sheila on the inside, penalized yet induced. She had been betrayed by fate itself. The hostage situation, once a singular moment of terror, had therefore evolved into a defining legend, an exemplary tale rumored through hallways and captions likewise, about the troubles of undervaluing a woman pushed too far, about the thin line between protection and manipulation, and about how the most ruinous traps are sprung with force but with understanding, tolerance, and the amenability to let an adversary reveal themselves exactly as they are. And as the time stretched on and feelings cooled, one verity endured over all others. The hostage extremity didn't simply shoot Sheila to captivity, it rewrote the moral chart of everyone it touched, leaving behind a heritage of safety bought at a price no could completely measure, and a moping apprehension that may be the most unsettling part of Steffy's master plan was that it worked, but that it made intimidating sense. As time dragged forward and the immediate hysteria surrounding the hostage crisis dulled into a low, constant hum, the deeper consequences of Steffy's actions began to surface in ways no one had anticipated, because while Sheila's imprisonment delivered the safety and finality Steffy had engineered, it also destabilized the emotional ecosystem that had defined the Forrester family for decades, creating a vacuum where fear once lived and replacing it with something far more unsettling, doubt, and in that doubt people began to question not only the ethics of what Steffy had done but the precedent it set, because if one person could orchestrate disaster in the name of protection and be quietly vindicated by the outcome, then the line between hero and villain became dangerously subjective. Steffy herself sensed this shift acutely, noticing how conversations paused when she entered a room, how admiration was now tinged with caution, how even those who defended her most fiercely spoke of her in careful tones, as if acknowledging her strength required acknowledging her capacity for destruction, and this awareness fed a growing isolation that no amount of professional success or familial reassurance could fully soothe. She became hyper-aware of her own thoughts, scrutinizing every instinct for signs of the same cold calculation she had used on Sheila, wondering whether that part of her had always existed or whether it had been forged by years of living under threat, because the scariest realization was not that she had changed, but that she might never be able to go back to the woman she was before fear taught her strategy. The children, blissfully unaware of the moral earthquake beneath their stability, became Steffy's anchor, their laughter a reminder of why she had done what she did, yet even that comfort was laced with anxiety, because she knew that someday they might learn the full story, might ask questions she was not sure how to answer, questions about whether safety justified manipulation, whether love could excuse calculated harm, and whether their mother's bravery came at the cost of her soul. In public, the narrative continued to evolve, morphing into documentaries, opinion pieces, and dramatized retellings that framed the hostage situation as everything from a tragic inevitability to a psychological thriller masterminded by a woman pushed too far, and with each retelling the truth became more abstract, more symbolic than factual, turning Steffy and Sheila into archetypes rather than people, which only deepened Steffy's sense of disconnection from her own story. Sheila, meanwhile, adapted to prison life with the same unsettling resilience that had defined her survival outside, cultivating alliances, trading stories, and positioning herself as both victim and legend, a woman undone not by her own madness but by a rival clever enough to weaponize it. And though most dismissed her claims as self-serving fantasy, a few listened, intrigued by the idea that the infamous Sheila Carter had finally met her match not in law enforcement or fate but in Steffy Forrester's relentless resolve. These whispers, faint as they were, fed Steffy's unease, because she understood better than anyone that Sheila thrived on narrative, on reframing reality until doubt took root, and the possibility that Sheila might one day twist the story again, might re-emerge as a cautionary symbol rather than a clear-cut villain, gnawed at her despite the locked doors and distant walls. Yet paradoxically, the longer Sheila remained imprisoned, the more Steffy's anger toward her faded, replaced by a complicated mixture of pity and responsibility, because she could not deny that she had played a role in shepherding Sheila toward her worst self, even if that self had always been waiting just beneath the surface, and this emotional complexity became its own burden, one she carried quietly to avoid reopening wounds that were barely scabbed over. Therapy, once a perfunctory gesture toward healing, became a necessity, forcing Steffy to articulate truths she had buried under justification, to confront the reality that while she had protected her family, she had also validated a worldview where control was safer than trust, where anticipating violence felt wiser than believing in restraint, and dismantling that mindset proved far more difficult than constructing it. Relationships continued to recalibrate, some deepening through brutal honesty, others fracturing under the weight of unresolved judgment. And Steffy learned that forgiveness, even when unspoken, was not guaranteed simply because the outcome had been favorable, because people needed to believe not just that she had done the right thing, but that she understood why it terrified them. Ridge and Taylor, bound by love yet divided by interpretation, represented this tension most acutely, their support unwavering but their concern palpable, as if they were waiting for the moment Steffy might apply the same ruthless clarity to a different conflict, one less easily justified by danger. Over time, however, life asserted its stubborn normalcy, drawing attention back to work, creativity, and the endless dramas unrelated to Sheila, And in this gradual return to routine, Steffy found a fragile sense of balance, learning to live with the knowledge of what she had done without allowing it to define every future choice. Though the vigilance never fully faded, the hostage crisis became a reference point, invoked whenever discussions of ethics, power, or protection arose, a reminder that extreme situations breed extreme solutions, and that survival does not always look noble in hindsight. And this collective memory shaped how conflicts were handled moving forward, with an unspoken understanding that some lines, once crossed, could never be erased, only contextualized. Sheila's story, frozen in that moment of exposure, served as both warning and mirror, reflecting the consequences of unchecked obsession and the dangers of underestimating an adversary capable of patience and foresight. And in this way her imprisonment became more than punishment. It became a symbol of what happens when manipulation meets manipulation.